Today I have with me renowned ancient historian Richard Carrier. As you can see, he is not ancient. That's just his history specialism. Richard, how the devil are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Excellent.
Got great weather out here in Ohio now.
Excellent. Good. So, first of all, many thanks for agreeing to do this interview. And I'm going to pitch in with some questions which I think our audience will be interested in your answers to. So, starting off, in our area of discourse, there are some very contentious words, aren't there? I mean, I often call myself a non-believer in order to avoid the connotations of purposeless, immorality, and God-hating that God-fearers deliberately attach to the word atheist. So, and you're sometimes described as a Jesus mythicist. I guess that attracts some flack too. How do you
Yes, it does.
Yes. How do you deal with that?
The way I figured it, any kind of words you use that people are going to attach those things to anyway. If you say agnostic, they say, "Oh, well, you're really an atheist," or something like that. So that you really can't avoid the negative connotations. No. I just use it if I have the opportunity to use it as an opportunity to explain what my views are and why. And so if it's something like, like you're mentioning atheism, people assume immorality. So actually, no, I am a humanist as well. And then that gives you an opportunity to talk about what humanist values are and why those are the foundation of your moral values and things like that. And then you've educated someone on something. And it's the same with mythicism. Like I'll say well, actually, I just think it's more likely than not Jesus started as a revelatory being, and then he was put in history just like a whole bunch of other gods were as a historical person. But I'm not certain of that. I think it's just the balance of probability. And then, of course, that starts a discussion of, well, what about this evidence, and so on. So then it becomes educational. That's how I approach that.
Yeah, always use it as a chance to teach. Good idea. Now, I'm prepared to accept that in biblical times, there were carpenters, and they had sons. But I draw the line at claims of Jesus' godliness, virgin birth, resurrection, and all the miracles. So how much of a mythicist are you exactly? Are you a hard mythicist, or are you maybe more like Bart Ehrman?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, infamously, of course, I am a hard mythicist. But it's worth pointing this out because a lot of people don't know that there's this other debate going on within secular mainstream Jesus studies. In secular mainstream Jesus studies, we all agree that the supernatural Jesus is a myth. So the gospel Jesus is a myth. It's a myth created by the authors of the Gospels. But the mainstream view, and the widest view held so far, is that nevertheless, there is an ordinary man, let's say, that started all of this, and that you can explain it historically how these legends and myths and supernatural claims got attached to him over time. And that's entirely plausible. That may well be what happened. And that used to be the position I defended against mythicists who claim that he was completely made up. I used to think that theory was ridiculous. Until I read Earl Doherty's book, The Jesus Puzzle, which presented an alternative hypothesis for the origins of Christianity that actually made more sense of the evidence, I thought, and at least had not been responded to by the mainstream consensus. And eventually, my fans got together and built a postdoc research grant for me to actually do research on this and actually publish books under peer review on this. And I ended up publishing the first peer-reviewed book examining the question of the historicity of Jesus in almost 100 years. And apparently it had just been assumed that Jesus existed and all other theories were built on top of that. No one had really published a book defending historicity as the foundational concept until like 1923, I think was the last one that this has been done through peer review on academic press. And the overall position I'm taking is that actually we should go a little further, that there's not even an ordinary man behind it. The actual founder of Christianity would be the first revelator, the first person who received a revelation, which would be Cephas, or Peter, is commonly known. Mm-hmm. He started the religion by having visions of this Christ figure. And Paul came along and he had visions of this Christ figure and made some changes and so on. And it was only about a whole lifetime later, by ancient standards, of average lifespans, that the Gospels got written, that they created this character walking around Galilee preaching parables and things like that. That's the theory. So now the debate is, okay, which one of those theories better explains the evidence? Can we rule out one or the other, and so on? And I think that's a fair debate.
Yeah, we have a devout mythicist locally, in fact, Ken Humphreys, who has got a website called Jesus Never Existed. You may have stumbled across him, yes?
Yes, of course.
Yes, he presents to our skeptics in the pubs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you have debated the best that Christianity can offer, William Lane Craig. And personally, I find him to be a presuppositionalist who mistakenly believes that arguments can provide conclusions rather than mere inferences. Now, I'm a retired science teacher, so I find that sort of pre-Renaissance style of thinking quite bizarre. What do you think?
It is bizarre, but it is characteristic of Christian apologetics. They very much love the Aristotelian syllogism, right? That will demonstrate a conclusion from unquestionable premises, and then they get really annoyed when you point out that their premises are questionable, and that the most you can get is a probability, and that in fact Aristotelian syllogisms don't work. Once you start talking probabilities, you need a different argumentative formula. Yeah. Nevertheless, that's what they come at us with, so we have to address them in those terms.
Yeah, and in any case, any thought process cannot be confirmed other than by observations that correspond in the natural realm. So,
yeah, so far, there will be some debate, I guess, over that in terms of whether religious experiences, for example, William Lane Craig will say he feels and experiences the power of the Holy Spirit that confirms things to him. It's like, is that a natural phenomenon or a supernatural phenomenon? Well, that gets the circular argument. That's precisely what we're debating. Is your brain just doing that, or is there an actual supernatural thing that's causing you to have those feelings? And so that's really what we end up debating. But oftentimes, the way he frames it is, you can't question this. It's like there's no possible way it's coming from anywhere else. And we're like, no, actually, we have lots of science that shows that it actually could be coming from just your brain. It's the same thing that's happening with Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, just about any religion throughout history has had the same experiences, which really confirms that it is a natural phenomenon. It's not coming from a supernatural being. Otherwise, it would have been consistent through the last 40,000 years, right?
In any case, whether it's a real revelation or a dream, it doesn't transfer. You can't share an experience. I mean, you can't share my pain, and I can't share your orgasm, which is probably just as well. So in that respect,
but of course we understand those things through communication. So, like, if someone experiences something that you did not, you generally are going to trust them when they report, this is what I experienced. The question isn't, and that's a question of, it's probabilities, like it's probability they're lying or whatever. But the real factor there is that we don't assume that what they experienced is what they concluded was. We can simply talk about, well, this is what you experienced. Now, how do you explain that experience? And that's different. And then you can get to like more objective evidence. We've got science of neurophysics and so on that can help us answer these questions. Anthropology tells us a lot of things, sociology, religion, and so on. So there's a lot of progress we can make in terms of what is the best explanation of what we're experiencing. But we do generally trust each other in terms of when we report what we are experiencing. Yes,
I'm a bit skeptical about that, because reportage is subject to a desire to go well with your audience, isn't it? And it encourages
for sure.
It encourages us to elaborate and exaggerate and possibly even lie.
Yeah, that's a good point, because that illustrates that context matters in terms of the reliability of report. Now, psychologists deal with this all the time when they do studies of how do you get a reliable first-person report from people in order to build statistical results out of. And they have, there's a whole body of literature about bias in experimental design and all of this. So they're on that. It's the Christian apologists that kind of like are pushing that under the rug and saying, no, we don't need to worry about scientific controls. And it's like, well, actually, you do.
Yes.
I need to worry about scientific controls.
Otherwise, you've got to believe my fairies in the bottom of the garden.
Yeah, and that's where. So I wrote this article on my blog. It's at richardcarrier.info for those who want to look
Great.
it up. But
Thank you.
it's called Bayesian counter-apologetics. And the
Mhm.
basic argument is that you can use Bayes' theorem, this sort of model of correct empirical reasoning, and say you could pick any argument for God. You could list them. I list 10 standard arguments for God. Every single one of them works by leaving evidence out. And when you put the evidence that they left out back in, it flips into an argument against the existence of God. And this is an example of that. I put this in here, religious argument from religious experiences. So you have someone like William Lane Craig come along and say, well, I feel the Holy Spirit is telling me stuff. Clearly, I have a much more reliable source, and I should trust that always. And therefore, that proves that there is a God. And then I come along and go, well, actually, you're leaving out all the other religious experiences of people saying the exact same thing, except they're getting different communications from different gods saying different things, conveniently always matching up with the culture and knowledge of their particular time. You could look through history and find this, and you could look currently through the ethnographic record and find this. And when you put that evidence back in, that's actually evidence against the existence of God. Because if there was a God, he would be giving everyone consistent messages, or at least far more consistent messages than we are getting, throughout time and throughout space. Yes. And that's not happening. So that actually shows that this is a natural phenomenon. Your brain is tricking you into thinking that this imaginary friend of yours really exists, and it's reassuring you and reconfirming things that you want to be true for whatever reason. And so I think you can pick any argument for God, and the same thing happens. When you put evidence back in that they're leaving out, it flips the other way. And so I think a lot of this is just sort of trying to wish away or ignore evidence in order to make the belief that they want to be true to them. And I think religion is built on that.
Yeah, it's odd, isn't it, that everyone's God coincidentally agrees with them.
Yeah.
Moving on, you've just been touring the US, haven't you? Did you go to the Bible Belt?
Say that again. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've been doing U.S. and Canada, actually, and we'll probably continue doing those tours. I love Canada. I love driving all across North America. I do need to do more Bible Belt stuff. I've done some. I do a lot of Midwest stuff, too. And some of those, the Midwest and Southern states tend to be the best attended events because they're the most beleaguered out there.
Yes. You're the controversialist out there, but not in California. Yes.
Right, exactly.
So there's a lot of hatred for atheists in rural America, isn't there? Do you ever feel at risk?
No, it used to be the case that, for example, there used to be that I would get hate mail and things like that. And that was 15 years ago, maybe. I think the atmosphere has really shifted, and there is hostility. You'll run into that. I still hear stories as I travel throughout America of people who've been fired from jobs or afraid of being fired from jobs, who know it will create family friction if they come out as an atheist, so there's still people who are facing this kind of prejudice, but the prejudice is it's even widely regarded as a bit of extreme. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I gave a talk in Manteca, California. Now, this is in the rural part of California, so this is very much like rural America. It's a red state area, even though the state itself is blue state, which is, it's mostly Democratic, but that's because the population is on the coast. But if you go through the rest of the state, it's a lot of conservative rural folk. And there was going to be a church. This whole church community, about a couple hundred people, were going to protest my talk at a community center. And now they'd done this to the previous atheist speaker at that community center, had surrounded the community center in this protest. And actually, all the other churches in town came out against them and said, "No, you don't do that. You're making us look bad." It's like, this is a public community center. They have a right to be here as much as anyone else. So they are our neighbors, basically. So there was this kind of acceptance of atheist rights and saying, you guys are going too far and making us look bad. So by the time I got there, all they did was that they rented a neighboring park and had their own little festival and stuff, sort of anti-Richard Carrier festival. So they weren't intimidating us by surrounding the thing, but they had this counter-protest anyway. But they were still kind of the outsiders, the outlier, really. The majority of Christians, even the conservative Christians there, were actually more eager to see atheists as neighbors or as someone that they want to try and befriend and convert, of course. They want to but they see it that way rather than the old McCarthy model of you clearly are a communist, an enemy of the state, and all, that kind of, you're a devil worshiper. That seems to be becoming more and more like the extreme minority view, and even a lot of conservative Christians are more positively inclined towards atheists. Doesn't mean that we've gotten rid of all the prejudice and difficulties. It's still difficult for an atheist to get elected to office and things like that. But it's been moving in a positive direction, surprisingly, in the last 15 years.
Good news, yeah. I asked Shelley Siegel that question about whether she felt threatened one time, and she said, "I've got a very large roadie who open carries a Glock." So she's not threatened.
Yeah. I never have to do anything quite like that.
Great. Now, you mentioned a book, and I know you've got several books out. And in fact, I'll put a link to your Amazon publications in the credits here. But are you currently working on something like that?
On what? Say again?
Are you currently working on a book?
Oh, yeah, I'm in contract for 2 books, actually, which will be shorter pop market versions of books I've already written, which were the dense academic versions. One is, of course, On the Historicity of Jesus, which you were just referring to earlier, which is my peer-reviewed academic book. It's, this huge volume covering every argument, pro and con, fully footnoted, 90-page bibliography and the whole thing. That's certainly the definitive treatment of the subject. But there's been a lot of demand and requests for something like a shorter pop market version of it. And so I'm going to be producing that eventually. And then another, also for my original book, my first book ever published, which was Sense and Goodness Without God, which was at the time the only full layout of an atheist worldview, including, political philosophy, aesthetic philosophy, moral philosophy, epistemology, semantics, building out metaphysics, building out the entire worldview and saying, here's a worldview to actually compare with the Christian worldview, and you can critique it, change it, make it your own in whatever way. I was hoping other atheists would come out with their own worldview books and then we'd have a bunch of ones to compare, but no one did. And so it still remains the one book on that subject, and that was published in 2005. So there's been demand for a shorter pop market version of that. Sort of people can hand out and say, here's an atheist worldview. I might not agree with everything in it, but it gives you a good example of how it compares and contrasts with Christianity. So I'm working on that as well. So those 2 will probably occupy me for the next 2 years, I'm expecting.
And are you aware of Professor Francesco Stavrakopoulou?
I am, yes. I'm really enjoying her wit and work. She handles herself really well on Twitter as well, which is great. To see a scholar who knows their stuff, is skeptical and doesn't put up with any guff.
Brilliant, eh? She says on TV in a debate forum, I think I'm going to get this quote right. There is almost nothing true in the Bible.
Wait, say that again?
There is almost nothing that's true in the Bible.
Awesome. That is a perfect example of what I was just talking about. Love it.
There's no messing. Anyway, we're running out of our time, so I'd like to go into my wind-up, because I personally avoid getting into arguments about the truth of the assorted, contradictory and fantastic claims of the Bible, because in my view it just gives it an undeserved credibility. But somebody needs to do it, and you're doing a great job. So on behalf of
thanks for saying.
On behalf of Atheist Alliance International, I'd like to thank you. Now,
I appreciate it.